Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. We're really looking forward to this session, which is on the SM5 and the SM7. With us is the one and only Mr. Michael Petterson, who is the who is the director of company history. Michael's depth of knowledge when it comes to just microphones and a lot of things to do with electronics is just really immense. So I encourage you all to please type in your questions as the session goes on, so that we can take most of those questions at the end. With us is also my very dear friend from the UAE, Mr. Barry Kasab. Barry is the market development manager for Shure in the Middle East and Africa. So without any further ado, over to Michael.
Thank you, Filey. Thank you, Barry. My wife is very appreciative that there is only one of me, by the way. So we do that. So for those of you who don't know me, and probably most of you do not, I have been at Shure since 1976. So I've been there for 44 years now. I knew Mr. Shure and Mrs. Shure very well, and I've spent my entire career there. I've had 5 different careers in marketing and engineering and sales. But now I get to be the historian, which is the most fun. So why did I create this presentation? Well, the SM7 microphone is now 47 years old, and just incredibly, it is now selling more than it ever has in its 47-year career. So I wanted to go back and look at the early years and kind of find out why is that, and talk about the SM5, which was the predecessor to the SM7. So let's start. So 56 years now, the SM5, and this is the one up here, and the SM7, of course, which is this one, have been popular for voiceover work, TV, radio, film recording, and podcasting, which we'll get to later. Both microphones employ the Unidyne 3 mic element, and the Unidyne 3 mic element came out in 1959. So if you want to think about this, the SM5 and the SM7 are the grandchildren of the Unidyne 1 and the children of the Unidyne 2. So let's explore their ancestry in brief. 1939, Shure brought out the Unidyne Model 55, probably our most famous microphone as far as its appearance, maybe secondary only to the SM58. But it was the world's first unidirectional cardioid capsule, moving coil dynamic microphone that only had a single capsule inside of it. There were cardioid microphones before the Unidyne one, but they were double capsules. They were an omni and a bidirectional, and then you had to combine them electronically to get the cardioid pattern. So this was a huge breakthrough to be able to make a cardioid pattern with a single capsule. March 1939, we introduced it. I only show you this. This is the flyer that came out just to show you what the price was. The price was $45 in 1939. And if we take the inflation into if we look at 2020 currency, it would be $835. So, it was not an inexpensive microphone when it came out. Now, who invented the Uniphase network? The Uniphase network is the acoustical principle that's inside the Unidyne. So Unidyne 1, Unidyne 2, Unidyne 3, they all employed this variations of the Uniphase network. And who invented it when he was only 24 years old? And it was this genius here, Benjamin B. Bauer. If you've attended other presentations from me, you'll find that I always mention Ben Bauer. And the reason is this gentleman here who worked at Shure from 1936 when he was 23 years old to 1958, had over 100 patents to his name, and virtually everything that we make today can be traced back to Ben Bauer. Even our modern array microphone that Ben Bauer laid out the concept for in 1938. The IEEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, felt that the Unidyne microphone was such a key invention of the 20th century that in 2014 we were awarded an IEEE Milestone Award. Let me show you that. Here it is. It was presented to Shure January 31st, 2014. These milestone awards, they recognize inventions and ideas and people and projects that had an impact around the world on electrical engineering and computing. Just to give you a little bit of background, other milestone awards that have been given out were for the work of Nikola Tesla, the creation of the internet, the breaking of the Enigma code during World War II, and the Apollo 11 moon landing. Now, there's been now almost 200 milestone awards, but this will kind of give you an idea of the other things that they have awarded for them for. And so we are very honored that they gave us one for the Unidyne microphone. This is a page I wanted to show you from our history. This is November 19th, 1937. This is from Ben Bauer's lab notebook. And this is the first day that he wrote down the principle of the Uniphase acoustical network. Little side story on this. These notebooks had been lost for nearly 60 years. We did not have them in our files in the Shure archive. And I wondered where they'd gone. Well, I got an assignment to go with our archivist and start looking through 500 boxes of storage material that was off-site, that kept it Shure. And we were paying every year for this storage, and our financial people said, let's make sure that what we have out there is worth keeping. So the first day we went out, we pulled 10 boxes at random, and the second box that I opened up had the Ben Bauer lab notebooks in them. And of course, I was thrilled. So I had the opportunity to read through both of the notebooks, photograph them, scan them, and so forth. And when I got to this page, the hair on the back of my neck stood up because I recognized this circuit here as the circuit for the Uniphase acoustical network. So you're looking right now at the first page, and I dated again, November 19th, 1937, where Ben Bauer, then 24 years old, came up with a concept of a single element microphone. You'll notice up here it says single crystal cardioid element. So he didn't not envision a dynamic microphone originally, it was a crystal element. But that there is a page that changed microphone history around the world. 4 years later, 1941, Ben Bauer got a patent for it. You might notice one thing. His name was Baumschweiger. Actually, that was the name that he was born with. He was born in Russia, or actually, excuse me, he was born in Ukraine. And his parents eventually emigrated to Cuba and then to the United States. So he changed his name from Baumschweiger to Bauer in 1941. But this circuit down here is pretty much the same one that was drawn on that page, which I just showed you. This, you're looking at the most important patent in Shure history, maybe one of the most important patents in actually in Shure, or not, excuse me, microphone, no matter who, microphone history as well. So 1939, we introduced the Unidyne one. That's the large one. Sometimes if you're on eBay, you'll see them, people call them the Fat Boy. Shure never called them the Fat Boy, but they've kind of had that nickname now. And in the early 50s, television was becoming an important media. And the television engineers and the producers said, well, we like the Unidyne one, but it's too large. Make a smaller one. So in 1951, we brought out the Unidyne 2, the 55S. S simply stands for small. And it was about 66% the size of the Unidyne 1. And that's the size we still make today in 2020. A year later, in 1952, the Unidynes, large and small, had become so popular that we ran this ad, the microphone that needs no name. I just like it because here's the ad over here on the right. If you look very carefully at it, you'll see that the name Shure does not appear anywhere in it. The Unidyne 1 and the Unidyne 2 had become so popular in those 12 years that the world really didn't even know. They saw it, they said, oh, that's a Shure. So finally, we're up to the Unidyne 3. So Unidyne 1, Unidyne 2, here's the Unidyne 3. And that debuted in 1945. Our advertising line for that was introducing the world's smallest cardioid dynamic microphone. At a price of $50. And you might know, look at this, it's an Amphenol connector. The XLR connector, which we're also familiar with now, was introduced in the late 40s. And it didn't really get popular as far as becoming the dominant microphone connector until the 70s. So in the 1950s, when we brought out the Unidyne 3, we put an Amphenol connector on it. The other difference on this is that this is a microphone that you speak into the end of it. If I back up one slide, you're talking to the side. This is a side address microphone versus an end address microphone. And we'll talk later about why that's important. So in 1959, Unidyne 3 comes out. Who invented the Unidyne 3? Well, it was this gentleman here, Ernie Sealer. He was born in Cuba, April 1920, and he had a German father and an American mother. And he joined Shure in 1953 after working for Electric Voice for 1 year. Excuse me, it's very early here in the morning. I'm going to take a drink of water. So Ernie worked his entire career at Shure, retired in 1997. And the Unidyne 3 was our first directional model where the performer sang into the end of the microphone. This is called an end fire, as I mentioned. And a key benefit of an end fire microphone is that it has a very uniform polar pattern, and this provides improved gain before feedback. You can turn it up louder before it feeds back in the sound system. This led to louder rock and roll concerts, stadium concerts, and so forth. And of course, now in 2020, Shure is well known for use in rock concerts and popular music. But what was interesting is that Ernie, who invented the microphone that all the people liked for pop music, really disliked rock music. He liked classical music. The frequency response to the Unidyne has this very prominent presence peak. It starts at 1,000 hertz, peaks up here to about 6 dB at 5 or 6 kilohertz, and then rolls off. Ernie thought this was a flaw. He wanted that microphone to be completely flat. That's what he was aiming at, and he never got there with it. But interestingly enough, that presence peak really became the sound of the Unidyne 3. And I often have wondered if he had been successful in making that flat up there, would the Unidyne 3 family of microphones be as popular as it is? I think the answer to that is no. There's another person from Shure history that was important. The gentleman's name is Bob Carr, and Bob was the professional products marketing manager at Shure in the early 60s. Sidebar from that, Bob was still there when I started working in 1976, and he taught me an awful lot about microphones. He was a mentor to me. So he proposed a new line of Shure microphones designed for radio, television, and film studios, and he was going to call them the SM line, the studio microphone line. This was based on microphones we already had in our line. It was based upon, at the bottom, our Model 33 Ribbon, our Model 550S Omni, our 546 Cardioid, and our 576 Omni. So we already had the tooling. Bob said, but I'm going to change it. First of all, I'm going to put a non-reflective dark finish on it so it can be used under television lights and not reflect the lights back. I'm going to put a 3-pin XLR connector on it, not the Amphenol, because broadcasters at the time preferred the XLR. He's going to have it wired as balanced low impedance, no unbalanced high impedance, which would have been typical for PA systems or for garage bands, if you will. And he's going to remove the on-off switch because you don't want to have an on-off switch when someone's on stage or on TV because it might get switched off, then how are you going to get back on? Or if there was a switch, he was going to hide it by the plate. So the 1964, we brought out 5 models, the SM5, SM33, SM50, SM56, and SM76, all variations on products that we already had, except for the SM5. Here's the SM5, 1964, the studio microphone. We had 2 versions, an SM5A, which is a 50 ohm output, and an SM5B, which is a 150 ohm output. Now, the 50 ohm output was designed for broadcast because at that time, many broadcast consoles, the microphone signal would go directly into the fader. And the fader was a 50 ohm fader. So you had the most efficient power transfer. You wanted the impedance of the mic to match the impedance of the fader. And that's why we had the 50 ohm versions. It was designed for overhead boom use for film and television to pick up dialogue. That's an exploded view of it. The price was $225, which if we still made it in 2020, would be $1,860 today. So you can see, again, not an inexpensive microphone. But up here in the upper right is actually became very popular for radio announcers. But that's not what we targeted at, and we'll get to that as we go on. Here's the first magazine ad for the SM5. This is from 1965. And you notice it doesn't talk about voiceover. It talks about dialogue. The ad touted cardioid pattern, uniform frequency response, good minimal off-axis coloration, the 2-stage windscreen. That's because there was an outer foam and then there was an inner foam on the actual front end of the capsule. Freedom from hum because there was no transformer and internal vibration. The capsule was suspended by rubber bands, for lack of a better term. But you can see it was not aimed at voiceover. It was aimed for dialogue. Now, most boom microphones are condensers. We did not have a condenser microphone in the 1960s. We did not have the technologies. And I'm certain that the customers Bob went to said, well, Bob, if you're going to have a professional line, you got to have a boom microphone. So he took the Unidyne 3 because it was the best thing we did and tried to turn it into a boom microphone, but it wasn't. Again, it was a, well, the condenser would have been a better choice. All we had was the dynamics, so we did the best we could. As we will find out in the future slides here, didn't work out so well for us. So from 1964 to 1969, the SM5 was having a really difficult time getting established. It was trying to be used for booms, but it was just kind of big and the output level was anemic. But at the same time, other Unidyne 3 microphones that we have were becoming really popular for live sound, and particularly at rock concerts. In 1964, we introduced the SM56. This is the predecessor to the SM57. And if you're familiar with the SM57 and you look at it, of course, you can see that's basically an SM57 stuck onto a pistol grip, as we call it. It was $81. It had the non-reflective gray finish, it had an XLR connector, and it had a front plate that hid a 3-position switch. The switch actually was off, low impedance, or high impedance. So most of the time that cover, it was set to high impedance and the cover was simply put on there. May not come across very well, but if you look very closely, you can see that there's actually the finish on this is a dark gray, and then there's these little, almost like black specks, which were painted on there. So it really was a two-tone finish, dark gray with black specks, or kind of a darker gray speck on it. This, interestingly enough, eventually ended up being a very popular microphone in Las Vegas, because Las Vegas had a problem with patrons stealing the microphones after a show. So eventually they started to put these microphones onto stands and use Loctite, which is a type of glue, that you could not unscrew the microphone from the stands. You had to steal the entire stands, and that really helped the theft problem that they had in Las Vegas. The Beatles did not use the SM microphones because they were brand new at the time, but they did use our 545s. And this is a concert tour in August 20th, 1965. The Beatles here are actually in Chicago, not too far from where Shure was located at. The reason I show this to you is because I just like the fact that this is how high-tech it was back then. Notice the foam windscreen held on by a rubber band. So here's the most popular vocal group in the world, and they're holding on their windscreens with a rubber band. I just think that's funny. But they were early adopters of the Unidyne 3 for live concerts. 1965, our SM57 came out. It carried a price of $63 back then. And of course, we all know it's a great onstage mic for snare drums and for guitar amps, but it's also been used since 1966 by the White House Communications Agency in the United States. It was first used for the President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1966, and it's been used with every president since then. Currently, the White House inventory is about 400 SM57s, and in the 54 years that they've been using it, there's never been a single failure at any time. There's been times maybe the microphone should have been switched off, but that's another story. 1966, we brought out the SM58. That hit the market in 1966. It was $81. Many people assume that this microphone was a big hit as soon as we introduced it, and that was not the case. In fact, our first year sales were 145 units. That was the entire year's sale. And our annual sales did not exceed 1,000 until 1971. So really, when did the SM58 take off as far as a vocal microphone? Started about 10 years after it had been introduced. Around 1976, it started to gain popularity. Now in 2020, I think we can arguably say it's the most popular mic for live sound in the world. 1967 in June was a big thing for Shure. This is the Monterey Pop Festival in California, and it was one of the first big outdoor pop festivals ever held. All the microphones on stage were the SM56. This is Jimi Hendrix performing there. There's a SM56 and with an A2WS windscreen on it. So while the SM5 was languishing, not doing well at all, the SM56 and the 57 and the 58 were slowly gaining popularity for live sound. But what about that poor SM5? In 1969, we decided to introduce a third model of the SM5. It was called the SM5C. It was like the SM5A, the 50 ohm version, but it had a 100 hertz high pass filter. This was to attenuate low-frequency transients that result when the microphone was whipped back and forth for boom operation. When that happened, there could be vibration, but there also could be wind turbulence, and these turbulences could cause low-frequency spikes. These spikes could actually distort the recording device that the SM5 was put into. So this high-pass filter removed those low-frequency spikes. And this is the interior view of the SM5. 1970. So now 6 years after the introduction, SM5 has been, frankly, not very popular at all. People were not using it for overhead boom use. And we knew we had to increase the output level, but it was a moving coil dynamic microphone. So how do you increase the output level? There's only two ways. You either add a bigger, stronger magnet, or you increase the length of the voice coil wire. But neither of those could be done without a really major engineering effort. So even if the sales had doubled or tripled, it turned out that the project cost to do that did not make economic sense. But at the same time, radio studios had started using the SM5 as a close talk on-air microphone for radio. So if you're close to the microphone, you really don't have to worry about output level. And this is the application that the SM5 gained a reputation for. But far fewer were sold than the outside world imagined. So this is a question to my audience and to Barry and to Folly while I take another drink of water. My quick question to you is, during the best sales year, the SM5, how many units did we sell in total? Take the SM5 plus the SM5B and the SM5C, and what was the total? What I'd like you to do is via chat or QA, just send in some estimates right now. I'm going to take a second and take another drink of water, and in about 15 or 20 seconds, we'll see what your answers are, and then I'll tell you what the real answer is. So please just send in your estimates. Folly or Barry, you get anybody sending any estimates in?
I don't see any estimates yet.
You want to guess yourself?
I'd be a little worried to take a guess at that.
No, why? You're not going to lose your job because of it. What do you think?
I'll say 200, roughly.
How many?
200.
And is that you, Barry? You said 200?
Yeah. Sorry.
Valley, any guesses?
No, the question actually says during the best sales year of the SM5.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
One second. We have a bunch of answers now. So Barry
Okay.
says 200. Wow. There's a guess that says what is this? 100,000. And there's another guess that says between 2 and 3,000.
Okay. All right. Those are all pretty good guesses. I hate to tell you, Barry was really close.
Oh.
Imagine that, 250 units. That's it in 1 year. SM5A, SM5B, and SM5C. Now, if you know anything about manufacturing, we buy parts for us to make these microphones. You go to a supplier of foam, you go to a supplier of the yoke and so forth, and you say you want to buy 250 a year, and they're just going to look at you and go, "Yeah, we'll get back to you," or they charge you a real high price. So the SM5, which has a great reputation in the radio industry, it was never a big seller for us. 250 units in 1 year is not a good selling microphone. So why was that? Well, the radio stations were the primary customers, but the SM5s, they didn't wear out, and they didn't stop working. You would replace the windscreens on a regular basis, and then you'd have a brand new SM5. So once a station had its inventory, they didn't need to buy them anymore. So it was never a big seller for us. And in 1988, that was 24 years after it had been on the market, we finally discontinued it. The price had risen to $586. So at NAB shows, National Association of Broadcasters shows, for years, radio people would come up to me or someone in the booth and say, "Why did you guys discontinue the SM5? That was the greatest microphone ever." But they had no idea we were only selling 250 units a year. And as a manufacturer, you just can't profitably support a microphone that sells that few. So we're going to go back to 1969. So, as I mentioned, it was expensive to manufacture. Some customers felt the SM5 was too large, so we started a project to offer a smaller, lower-cost model. And by the end of 1972, the SM7 was ready. The SM7 was a variation of the SM57 element. It had a vibration isolation mount. That's a variation of our A53M or A55M rubber donut. The yoke mount was simply a variation of the SM5, but there was a new industrial design for the SM7, which was new and innovative, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So here is the flyer, 1972, for the SM7 when it first came out. It was announced in 1972, but it was not sold until 1973. So I think it was November or December we announced it, and then we sold our first units in January or February. The price was $256.80, and the voiceover market was what we were aiming at. We had kind of gave up on the overhead boom use. The features of the SM7, which are still the same features today, you had the 4 frequency response settings where you can change how the microphone sounds. You had the air suspension mount inside. You had the integral pop filter. That was the outer windscreen, and then the grill inside of that, and then the capsule set back from the front, and then the piece of foam over the capsule. There was literally 4 stages: foam, metal grill, airspace, and then additional foam. Had the uniform pattern, cardio pattern. Of course, it was a Unidyne 3, and there was no output transformer, and that was to minimize hum pickup if the microphone was placed close to a hum source. Here's the inside. There's the SM7 when it first came out. 3 things. There is a humbucking coil on it. There is the rubber donuts. And then here is a rear acoustical chamber, which basically extends the low frequency response. You probably know the SM7 has a really good low end, and partially that is due to this extended acoustical chamber at the end of it. Here's the gentleman that designed it. His name was Jerry Pleiss, and I knew Jerry very well, and I learned a lot from him as well. He was a microphone development engineer for 30 years at Shure. But interestingly enough, microphone development engineers typically develop the insides of the microphone, not the outside. So Jerry worked on the way the microphone sounded in the interior of it, but he also sketched ideas for the outer appearance. And because of that, he got a patent. And here is the design patent from 1974 of Microphone, and it's the SM7. Awarded to Jerry Pleiss, or Gerald Pleiss, in Morton Grove, Illinois. That's where he lived. And this is interesting because it is very unusual for a development engineer to get a design patent. There are 2 types of patents in the United States. There is a design patent, which is how the microphone looks, and there is a utility patent, which is how the microphone operates. So the Unidyne 3 utility patent, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is what covered the inside of the microphone, and this design patent is what covered the outside of the microphone, how it appears. So for 26 years, the SM7 pretty much remained the same. And then in 1999, we introduced a new version of it. This is called the SM7A. There had always been a humbucking coil in there, but it needed to be improved and redesigned because now radio stations were adding computer monitors near the announce station so that the on-air announcers would read text off the computer rather than off a sheet of paper. And these CRT tubes often had a magnetic interference field that they created, and the mightphone would hum. So we had to improve the humbucking coil inside the SM7A for that application. At the same time, we changed the yoke mounting because sometimes people like to hang it upside down. Sometimes they had it right side up. And the yoke mounting, the way it was before, was a little difficult to do. So we improved the yoke mounting at the same time. And that was 2 years later that we introduced the SM7B, which, of course, is the current version of it. The only difference between the SM7B and the SM7A is this larger foam windscreen. And if you look at that windscreen really carefully and you think about the SM5, it looks very much like the front end of an SM5. That was on purpose. We had many people who were still very loyal to the SM5 and wanted us to bring it back, even though it had by then been discontinued for 12 years. So we made the SM7B, look like the SM5 by adding this windscreen. And that really helped. And many of the people that liked the SM5 started buying the SM7 because of the fact that now the SM7 looked like the SM5. 1973 to 2008, annual sales of the SM7 were relatively stable. It was a much better selling model than the SM5, but it wasn't great. But it was good enough to keep around. 2008, podcasters streamers discovered the SM7B, and it was 35 years old at the time, and the annual sales began to increase. Now here it is, 2020, a very strange year for many reasons, including the COVID lockdown. But in 2020, we expect the annual sales for the SM7B to be 25 times greater than they were in 2007. That to me is amazing. Here's a 47-year-old microphone that is having the best sales year in its entire 47 years. And in 2023, will turn 50 years old. So microphones are strange devices. Sometimes they can be around for decades and no one pays much attention to them. And they get popular and they take off like crazy. And that's what's happened with the SM7B. Next, I'm going to show you some slides of some notable uses of the Shure SM7 microphones. Unfortunately, I apologize in advance, almost all these microphones are United States centric. So if you don't know these people, don't worry about them, but we will show you that they've been used on TV and radio and recording and also for podcasting. So let me just show you these very quickly. This is a television show that was popular in the United States in the early 90s. It was called Northern Exposure. The actor is John Corbett, and he played a disc jockey that was on air in this little town in Alaska, and he used an SM7, but they always had the front windscreen removed, and I'm not sure why that was, except that it was a very low-budget radio station, and maybe it was to show that they couldn't afford the windscreen on it. But that is an on-air shot of how they used the SM7. Interestingly enough, you could always see the Shure logo on there, and that was advertising we could have never paid for. A current show on Netflix is called Dear White People. Also takes place on a radio station. Here's the actor Marquis Richardson, and he's on an SM7. This SM7 has a plate over the back to cover the switches. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Wolfman Jack was a very popular DJ in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s in the United States. He worked at WNBC in New York City. The SM7 was his choice. Current on-air radio personality is named Robin Givers. He's on Sirius XM, and she uses an SM7 for many years. And National Public Radio in the United States also uses the SM7 as their on-air announce microphone. They have a talk show called 1A. All of positions, all the announcer and guest positions have the SM7. The most famous recording ever made with the SM7 was the Thriller, the Michael Jackson album from the 80s, and the producer is Quincy Jones. Here's the only shot I've ever been able to find of that record being made. There's Michael Jackson singing into it, Quincy Jones listening, and you might notice that this is a very unusual windscreen. They had taken a pop filter from a Neumann microphone and basically carved it out so it was large enough to fit over the SM7. So that's why you've got an SM7 there with a non-Shure windscreen. But the Thriller album with Michael Jackson is probably the most famous SM7 recording ever made. Podcasting, as I mentioned, is huge for the SM7. Here's ex-President Barack Obama, and here's the interviewer Mark Maron on his show WTF. SM7 here, SM7 there, SM7 there, of course. And a famous actress in the United States named Anna Faris does a podcast called Unqualified, and there's her with her SM7. So, I'm going to get towards the end now. We're going to talk about some questions. John Cleese there was doing his silly walk. Here's some common SM7 questions I'd like to answer for you. What does Unidyne mean? I've been using it throughout the entire presentation. Unidyne was first used for the Model 55 in 1939, and actually has several meanings. Uni equals a single mic element, but it also means a unidirectional pattern. And dyne is a dynamic mic element, but it also is a unit of force used in acoustics. So we combine those two syllables together to give us Unidyne, and that was granted to Shure as a trademark in 1960. So we've used that term since 1939 and used it as a trademark since 1960. This is one of my favorites. Can a singer damage the SM7 with excessive sound pressure levels? Well, we believe the answer is no. Why is that? Turns out the actual maximum excursion length, the travel the diaphragm can move in an SM7, is about 1/1000th of an inch. So if someone could scream loud enough to make that diaphragm move 1/1000th of an inch, it would simply hit the magnetic pole piece and move no farther. So you can't damage it. You may be able to create a distorted output because it becomes nonlinear at the case, but you're not going to damage the SM7 with excessive sound pressure level. When was Unidyne 3 patented? That's the internal side, not the external. That was 1966, and here's the patent drawing for the Unidyne 3. This is a utility patent, so that covers how the microphone operates, and you can see that the inventor was Charles Ernest Sealer, as I showed you before, Evanston, Illinois, which happens to be the town I'm in right now. Ernie lived about half a mile from me. This drawing down here, simplified acoustical analog, is nearly exactly the same as that 1937 drawing I showed you by hand by Ben Bauer in his lab notebook. Do the SM7 and the do the SM7 and the SM57 and 58 use the same element? They're nearly the same, not exactly. The SM7 diaphragm, it's the same size, the same shape as the SM57, but it's not as thick and it's more flexible. It's more compliant, and that helps adding the low-end frequency response. And the SM7 voice coil has a thinner wire and has 3 times as many terms as the SM7 voice coil. Why is that? It's because the SM7 has a transformer in the output to step up the voltage. The SM7 does not have that transformer, and so you have to have more windings on the voice coil to give you that output level. What's the origin of the SM7 model number? Well, it's simply a sequence. In 1963, we had created an SM3 ribbon microphone, which was never introduced. We have these 2 examples in the archive, but we never brought it out. Then was SM5 in 1964, SM7 in 1973. We did use SM1 and SM2. They were model numbers on on-air headsets that were used by sports broadcasters, and we brought those models out in 1984, 85. They were around for about 20 years. We've never used SM4, 6, 8, or 9, but of course we do have current models of KSM8, KSM9, which kind of fit into there. Here's the switches I talked about. There are these 2 switches on the SM7, which can either roll off the low frequency or have the low frequency be flat, and can boost the high end or have the high end be relatively flat. In 1969, we introduced 6 inline audio adapters. These adapters were about 4 or 5 inches long, XLR connector in, XLR connector out, and they were passive, and they were designed to put in right after the microphone to change the output level, to change the frequency response. So we decided to take 2 of those functions from the A15 and put them into the SM7. One was the A15 HP, the high pass filter, which reduces or attenuates bass frequencies. And the other was the A15 RS response shaper, which basically attenuated or reduced the treble frequencies. So there's 2 switches on the back right here. And this one here, you can switch up or down. And when it's down, it shows you it's a bass roll off. That's this down here. And when it's up, it's flat response. And on this side, when it's up, it gives you this peaked response. And when it's down, it gives you that flat response. So you have 4 different frequency recurves, which are inside the SM7. And you can use that to match the announcer's voice. The standard, if the switches were not in there, the response curve of the SM7 would be this low end here with the peaked response, which of course looks very much like an SM57 with an extended low end, which is essentially what it is. So final trivia here, I mentioned the dark gray, the SM5 had a dark gray windscreen and a light gray windscreen, dark in the back, light in the front. Yeah, that's it. And that color screen was based on the 2-tone finish of the SM mic handles. I mentioned that before. The base color was a lighter gray, and then they had the black or dark gray paint flecks. So we took that as the basis of it, and then we put that on for the colors of the SM5 windscreens. Both the mic element in the SM5 and the mic element in the SM7 are set back from the leading edge of the foam, and that's to reduce P-popping. If that cartridge was right behind the phone, you get more P-popping, so we set it back probably an inch or 2, and that helps to reduce P-popping. I talked about the SM7-8 redesign, about the radio stations and the CRT, so we can skip over that. Neither mic had an output transformer, because that reduced hum pickup from nearby lighting or other things that might create a magnetic interference field. And in 1973, the SM7 had a user price of $257. In 2020, it's actually $499. If it kept pace with inflation, the SM5B would be $1,485 in today's dollars. So what a bargain. You can actually get a brand new SM7B for $1,000 less than it should have been. So to wrap it up before we get to the questions, it's now 47 years after it was introduced. The SM7 still continues to be a big favorite for engineers, performers, podcasters, streamers. I've heard even gamers use this. I don't know why you'd need a microphone of this quality for gaming, but let them go for it. And my question to the audience is, do you remember your first SM7? I certainly remember mine. I actually bought two my second year at Shure. So it would have been 1978, and I have them in my basement, and I still use them. So with that, gentlemen, let's open it up to any questions. I can't imagine Barry doesn't have a question, but let's see if some of our audience members have a question as well, okay?
All right. Lovely one, Michael. So we'll just
Thank you.
Check. I'm pretty sure myself that Barry has a bunch of questions.
I know he does.
I'll let Barry start it off with some of his questions.
Oh, Barry's muted. Barry, are you muted?
Can't hear you.
Hey, sorry, I did mute mine. Yes.
No worries.
So, yeah, I had a few questions during your presentation. I kind of flew off my mind, but I might have a comment at the moment. But probably I'll pick up a question or two in a bit.
You are using an SM7 though, and it looks like Folly is too. So
with the fats.
Yeah, yes. with the SM5 windscreen. Yeah,
exactly. The comment was that in the extreme rock or the extreme metal, let's say, it's quite a famous mic without the windscreen. So they put a popper in front of it.
Oh.
And the reason why apparently the windscreen, especially the fat one, reduces the highs.
It would.
The frequency response of the highs. So to get more transparent highs, they just remove it and put a popper.
Okay.
And then they get a nice, the rasp, the throaty sound becomes more obvious on the mic.
Yeah. Follow, you're a front of house engineer. Have you used it for that purposes as well? Yeah.
I in fact bought my first SM7B about 3 weeks ago.
He's a latecomer.
It's one of the mics that I've always wanted to own. I own a lot of microphones, and this one finally got added. And I have a lot of friends, in fact, that used it to record guitars for their album. In fact, a very famous guitar player from Mumbai called Warren Mendonça. He goes by the name of Blackstrat Blues. All three albums, SM7B was the primary on the guitar cabin.
Yeah. So you're just starting to experiment with your new one. That's good.
There's no need to experiment. That's the best part. You just take it out, plug it in, and you know it's good to go pretty much.
Yeah, mine are from 1978. I haven't replaced them. I've added the big windscreen just in case I wanted to use it. But So do we have some questions coming in?
Yeah, we have a few questions. Firstly, a comment that says "super presentation, loved it." So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. The comment. I appreciate that.
So there's a question here that says sometimes users and sound engineers modify microphones, and one example of that is removing output transformers in an SM58 for a different sound character. How do we at Shure feel about this? And I have a very suspicious feeling about this question because I received an email exactly with respect to this a few days ago.
Here's the thing. If you want to do that because you like the way it sounded, that's fine. That's up to you. But keep in mind, the output transformer does step up the voltage, so you are going to reduce the output level. And I guess, I don't really know, but it's probably by 10 or 12 dB would be my guess. And the other thing to be important about that is that the rear end of the SM58 and 57 has to be acoustically sealed. If it's not acoustically sealed, it changes the low end, and it really affects how the vibration mount works. So if you do that, and then you open up an air leak, even a small one, you're going to really change the way it sounds. So if you want to say, I want to remove the transformer to make it sound different, that's fine. If you say, I want to remove the transformer to make it sound better, we probably would disagree with that. Barry shakes his head.
Well, actually, today I was watching a video about that. Since the SM7B is transformerless, so I was curious to check the transformerless SM57s. So there's a guy actually who removed the transformer and he did a test. So apparently it sounds darker. There's a 10 dB loss in the output,
Yep.
just like you mentioned. But the biggest issue is the amount of noise buildup because of the amount of gain that you need to push to make the SM57 sound in par with the SM57 with the transformer is enormous. So it makes it the SM57 way noisier than they think. Plus, the shock mount will stop working because the shock mount relies on the vacuum in the back of the microphone.
Right.
So
right.
yes, the shock mount will be completely useless.
Yeah, it does not work with it. And that's part of the patent. If you read the patent, that
Yep.
air volume, trapped air volume, actually acts like a spring, if you will. So.
Yep.
Okay, next.
So there's another question here that says, or do you have any cases where the SM7B has actually been used for stage and stage drama?
I'm not aware of any. You mean like miking at the front of the stage or something like that?
Yeah, possibly. Maybe to replace like I wouldn't imagine to replace a shotgun, but
No.
Yeah.
No, I'm not aware of that. I mean, typically the SM7 is a close talk mic or a microphone you use close to the source. It's, again, as I mentioned, the output level is determined by the strength of the magnet and by how many coils of winding there are on the voice coil. So typically using that at a distance, I wouldn't do it. I mean, I guess maybe if you're trying to mic a rocket being fired off or something, you can put it at a distance. But other than that, it's pretty much a close talk or a close miking product.
I think all of the applications that we've come across so far is, remember Barry, I done a session with the front of house engineer for Iron Maiden, and was surprised to know that they used an SM7B on the bass guitar cabinet. And it was the same story with Metallica. So SM7B was used to mic the bass guitar cabinet. And I think as far as India goes, there are a lot of people using them, and I didn't want to pull pictures from people's Instagram to put in this presentation, but
Understood.
For people that are here, if you guys know Divine records most of his stuff on SM7B. There's a guy called Arjun Kanungo, very, very famous guy, SM7B. Preetham, famous music producer, SM7B. A lot of podcasters, a lot of radio stations, in fact, also use an SM7B.
Cool.
It's become quite a popular mic here now.
Yep. Next one.
I got a question for you, Michael, here.
Yes.
That just crossed my mind when he said when he mentioned the KSM8.
Yeah.
And I've been toying around with the KSM8 for a while, and I see a lot of potential in that mic bringing a lot of the elements from the SM7B. First, it has a very flat frequency response. The proximity effect, as well as the SM7B does not show proximity effect as much as other microphones due to the distance.
Yep.
So how do you think about the KSM8 going in light of what the success that the SM7B showed?
I think I'm not aware of us working on a project like that, but I'm not really in that. I know one thing we would do is we would never touch the SM7B in any way because it's so popular. It's like it's the Coca-Cola, right? It's like the SM58 or the SM7B. You don't touch it. We might design another microphone, but I don't think there's been a lot of requests yet for a low proximity announcer's voices, because most of the time announcers like to have their voices sound bigger than normal on that. So I'm a little bit afraid that if we brought out a low proximity announceable voice, that it would go, meh. But I'm not in marketing, Barry, so I really can't answer that. So I'll say I don't know.
Nice one.
Fair enough.
There's a question here that says, what's the craziest use of any Shure microphone that you have ever seen in your career?
Well, craziest. There's a lot of weird things, but here's the one that I enjoy telling the most. In the late 1970s, I was in sales, but I also was a technical person, and I got I think it was a phone call. This is before the internet, from NASA, the U.S. Space Agency, and they wanted to have some type of acoustical trigger to use on the space shuttle. So it turned out that every space shuttle that went up had two SM11s, which are just small dynamic lavalier microphones that were embedded in the chassis of the space shuttle down by where the rockets were. And when the rockets lifted off the space shuttle off the pad, the SPL was, well, we could only guess what it was, but it was probably close to 185 dB SPL, which is basically almost 2 atmospheres. And the signal levels from those microphones would trip a relay, and the relay would open up a vacuum bottle, which would suck in exhaust gases as the space shuttle went up. And the reason they wanted to do that is when the space shuttle came down, they could open up the vacuum bottles, and the exhaust gases could be analyzed to see if the rockets were firing properly. But it was an acoustical trigger, which was these little tiny SM11s, which cost $70 as part of the space shuttle. And there were two on every space shuttle that went up, and one of them failed one day, and NASA sent it back to us, and it came to me because I was part of that project, and we had to do an analysis of it. Why did it fail? Anytime anything failed on the space shuttle, anytime anything failed on the space shuttle, you had to analyze it. So we got it, we analyzed it, and the reason it failed is because NASA had crimped the cable so hard, it broke the cables. Microphone worked perfectly well. So that's the wireless. And by the way, then NASA said, how much do we owe you for the analysis? And I said, well, if you let me keep the microphone, you don't owe me anything. So in our great hall, in our exhibit in Niles, you will see one of those SM11s that was in space 35 times. So that to me is probably, I don't know if it's the wildest, but pretty much the most interesting thing we ever used it for.
And is it rated at 137 SPL as per the spec sheet?
Well, no, if you look at the dynamic microphones, I don't think any of the dynamic microphones have any spec on it, because the fact that the maximum sound pressure level is when the diaphragm stops moving. So I don't think there's a spec sheet on there. I could be wrong, but I doubt that there's an SPL on a dynamic mic. We simply just can't create anything that's that loud. But that's my favorite story.
That's quite interesting. I like that.
Yeah. Next one, Sally. What we got?
Next one, and this gentleman that wants to know actually what's the best microphone from Shure that we can use for stage drama, like our shotguns.
Oh man, I mean, so much theater now is done with wireless microphones on the people. The average person has gotten so used to close miking that when you try to do stuff from the stage front, it just doesn't have the same impact. So, I mean, some of our boundary microphones are used, like the SM Beta 91 kick drum mic is but that's maybe for like tap dancers or going across the front. But I think that the audience, the person writing that question, if you hear anything mic'd from a distance at a theater, you're going to be disappointed. Most of the time when there's something at the front of the stage, if they're shotguns or something, they're probably not used for sound reinforcement. They're probably used to send a signal backstage so that people in their dressing room can know where this play is at. But in 2020, pretty much everything in the theater is wireless microphones hidden on the actor somewhere. You may not see them, but that's what it is. So, I mean, you could look at shotguns, you could look at low-profile boundary microphones, but I don't believe you're going to be happy with the results. That's just my opinion. Gentlemen, you can add your own opinions if you'd like.
I mean, most of the time when I used to mix theater is we usually had boundaries and shotguns just as standby, just in case, we lost a lav. And then we got into the thing of actually double laving everyone. So there were 2 lavaliers per person. And, now there was a theater program that was done in January, which was quite popular in India. So for anyone that's aware of the show called Chota Bheem, it's a very famous TV show, and then they took it to theater. And in that show, in fact, they had 2 AD transmitters per person with twinplex, and they were using frequency diversity. So that's where, the mics automatically switches over in case there's a problem with one of them.
Yeah.
So that's the most robust way to do it, and the boundaries mostly would be used as standby. I think where you'd actually use the shotguns would be like for a audience miking for a band for the in-ear monitors. So that's where shotguns would be really, really useful.
Yeah. we get this in the United States all the time, and let's imagine it's not a COVID year where everybody's kind of hunkered down. But I always laugh that, yeah, there's always a springtime break around March or so, and then the drama teachers in grade school and middle school, they all go to New York City to see theater, and they come back and they're all excited and they want to create that same experience for their grade school kids, not realizing they just saw a show that was probably $300,000 worth of wireless microphones that they never saw, right? And they come back and they want to do it. They say, and we want to mic all our kids with wireless, and it'll be great. And it's like a grade 6 production. And and I say, oh, let's see, well, that you might be able to rent that for maybe $20,000 per week, and you just because it's become so transparent now that the audience doesn't realize what's going on behind the scenes. But
yeah, they also guess the things suspended in the ceilings are the microphones. They think it's only 5 or 6 microphones in the ceiling that would work.
Yep.
Yeah, I think even speaking on the VP88, which is known to be a stage microphone as an ambience stage microphone, even that one is about $1,400.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, if you get 4 of those to cover the whole stage, you're already talking about a number not less than $6,000.
Right, and most of the time they want it for sound reinforcement because the kids don't speak up and so forth. And unfortunately, as we know, the potential acoustic gain equation always applies. And if you've got a microphone that's 10 feet away, you're not going to be able to get much gain out of that.
Yeah.
Darn physics! Physics always wins.
True.
So cool. We've got one last question, and our friend here wants to know, which is the one microphone that we can suggest that can be pretty much used for anything?
There's been several articles written in magazines about that. If you had one microphone to take to a desert island, what would it be? And almost always the answer, it seems to be the SM57. That seems to be the one that people just really like a lot. So, I would say a Unidyne 3 of some sort. And the SM57 is a really versatile microphone. I know.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion, by the way, but that's you can chime in if you will.
I've almost deviated from this right now. I think Fally knows my favorite mic.
What's that?
Mine is the SM8 so far.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
If I want to go to a gig and I want to take a microphone that would work anywhere, I would take the SM8.
Yeah. And have you used it for miking like guitar cabinets or snare drums or anything like that? You have.
Absolutely.
Really?
We actually did a webinar using the SM8, and it actually was one of the best sounding mics on the guitars.
Wow, that's cool. Well, thank you for that hint. I like that. That's cool. Any other questions, Fally? Or
no, that's it actually. That's the last question. There's another gentleman, Vijay Benegal. He's a very famous engineer from Mumbai, and he says a great session and thank you very much.
Well, first of all, gentlemen, thank you for asking me. I always enjoy doing these, particularly since they're so easy. I just moved from my bedroom over here, and that's nice. But I'm happy to do more in the future. And if any of your audience members have questions for me, historical questions particularly, you can reach me by support@shure.com and it'll get sent to me. Or if you want to send something to Barry and Fally, they can forward it over to me as well. But I appreciate doing this. I'm glad the audience members had. How many audience members did we have? Does it say? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we had about 40 today.
Oh, okay, great, wonderful. That's certainly good. And happy to do other ones. I've got other projects and other subjects we can talk about. But this one is fairly new. This is only the second time I've used it, so I hope it went out well. And if you two guys give the thumbs up on it, then I'm happy.
Yeah, there's a lot of thumbs up now coming in the chat section as well. So great session. I think considering that a lot of these mics that do so well sales wise are pretty old. It's always like people are always keen to know the beginnings and how the mic actually came to being, and why after 50 years of having the mic we didn't need to really change much. So I think we'll keep doing these sessions, and in the polls that we put as per what the next session should be, a lot of people want to see the damaged Shure products, damaged.
Oh, I've got one of those. I call it Shure Survivors.
Sure.
Yeah, we can show you that. That's actually kind of fun, and I've got like photos of these things from the archives. You know, your
Nice.
comment though about the microphones being old and still being used. Though they are old and though the designs are basically the same, there have been a lot of improvements inside. There are new adhesives. We do laser welding. There's better improvement as far as the acoustical resistance. So they're not static. They change all the time, and they get better and better and better as far as the reliability of it. So the basic concept is the same. The basic appearance is the same. Yeah. But inside, there are a lot of things that we have changed. And typically, those are not advertised because we want to keep them our secrets.
All right. Cool, Michael and Barry. Thank you very much for a very cool session. We will plan something very soon.
Great.
Regarding the next one. And
looking forward to it.
See you guys soon. Take care.
Okay, guys. See ya.
Thank you, Feli. See you soon, Michael.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome.